So let's start off by looking at the first process in the scope management knowledge area, and that is plan scope management. Like I said earlier, the output from this will be a how document called the scope management plan. Looking at what's required as an input here, the project management plan, although still being refined, is a useful reference because it states how the scope will be gathered, how it will be defined, how it will be decomposed into lower levels, how it will be validated and managed. The project charter, because it contains a high-level description of the scope of the project, the enterprise environmental factors, as they will have a bearing on everything that will be in the scope management plan, and of course organisational process assets, and this will include any tools that will be used in the other processes such as work breakdown structures and so on. When it comes to the tools used in this particular process, we have expert judgment. Again, this will be bringing in knowledge experts, skill experts, or people with experience of planning scope management or managing scope from previous similar projects. The way in which this information will be gathered will normally be via meetings, as the flow of documents are gradually created, reviewed and approved. The main output here is the scope management plan. It's not the only one, but this defines how the scope documents will be prepared and how the remaining scope processes after this one will be carried out. The structure and contents of the scope management plan normally states the overall responsibility for the management of scope. This normally won't just be the project manager, as we'll be getting these from requirements, and there'll be many stakeholders, groups and individuals that need to be named to ensure their full cooperation. Any special methods and tools used to define, measure and verify the project scope itself, a description of how changes to scope will be managed, maybe this is a process that already exists, another example possibly of an organisational process asset, and the acceptance process for the project products or deliverables if you will, and for scope verification and validation. The second main output from this is the requirements management plan, which states what activities are needed to gather and manage the project requirements. Just like the scope management plan, this is a how-to, and it describes how the requirements will be gathered in the first place, how any decisions are to be made, how changes will be handled, and how the requirements will be documented. A quick look at a high-level picture of how scope management ties in with other processes. We've already developed the project charter, and that's the output from that process. In a much later module, we'll be covering the stakeholder management knowledge area, and one of the processes there will be identify stakeholders, and out of that comes a stakeholder register, which lists all of the stakeholders involved on this project. Now that is important because in this module, we'll be covering the collect requirements process, and knowing who the stakeholders are will help us understand who we need to work with. The output of that is the requirements documentation itself, and that leads to defined scope. The output of that is the project scope statement. Now, this leads to creating the work breakdown structure, which we'll be doing in the next module, and we have the work breakdown structure dictionary out of that and the work breakdown structure itself. Now, the main output from create work breakdown structure is in actual fact the scope baseline, but I didn't want to put that here because it may confuse you. What you need to know here is the scope baseline includes the project scope statement and the work breakdown structure and the work breakdown structure dictionary. We'll clarify that when we cover that in the next module. Going on to validate the scope, and the outputs here are any change requests as a result of validating it, the accepted deliverables and updates to the project documentation. Leaving us with control scope, which uses the project management plan because like all control processes, it compares the plan with what's actually happened, and inside the project management plan is the scope baseline. So that's our reference point against which to control scope.